Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, so continuing on with our X-Men encyclopedia, in this one I want to run over the chronological history of mutants in Marvel Comics. Now for those of you guys who have been around my channel for a little while, you know that we've kind of talked about this in various forms. Like we did our X-Men Explained and we touched on it. We've talked about characters like Gabriel Shepherd, different things like that, but we haven't really done a comprehensive history of mutants in Marvel Comics. So that's what we're going to do here. Now, this really all kind of kicks off with what's called the first host. Now, we've talked about the first host a bunch of different times, so if you're familiar with that, bear with me here on this. But the way this basically played out is that in the universe you have what are called Celestials. Now the Celestials don't really have names. I mean they do insofar as they give each other names, but we don't really know what they were before they were Celestials. All we're kind of left to believe through a combination of the old like Roy Thomas stories and Neil Gaiman's Eternals and looking at what Al Ewing did with the Ultimates, all we really got through a combination of those things is that the Celestials basically came into existence with the universe, right? They're always there. If you go look at the Ultimates by Al Ewing, it's more that they were created by the first universe and then just kept being reborn every time the universe or the multiverse was recreated or a universe was destroyed and remade. But by whatever manner and whatever means, the Celestials came into existence. And the result is that they really became more of one, creators insofar as they created life across the universe. And then two, they would experiment on that life, right? So they were scientists, different things like that. And so while Earth was not the first planet they did it at, they did it at a whole bunch of other different planets too, the Skrull home planet and so on. They visited Earth in the very early days of man, roughly around 1 to 1.5 million years ago. And what they did is they encountered a group called the Wanderers. Now, the Wanderers were basically Marvel's variation of this missing link, evolutionary stance of man between primate and modern man, right? So the Wanderers were basically gathered by Gaia, who was the living sentience of the planet, right? Like Mother Earth, more or less. And then they were brought before this gathering of the Celestials, which it was Gammonon the Gatherer, and then he split them into thirds and then handed 1/3 to each different Celestial, right? So one group went to Xeron the Tester, the other one went to Nazar the Calculator, and the last one went to Oneg the Prober. Now, when it came to Xeron the Tester, what he did is he kind of mutated their genes, but all he did was destabilize them. And what that did was it created the deviants, right? These troll-looking beings that were out there. Following that, you went into Nazar, who basically created these like Eternals, right? These heavenly beings, these almost angelic in terms of how they appeared, right? They had perfect skin, the ability to tap into cosmic energies and all kinds of cool stuff. And then you had Oneg the Prober. Now, Oneg the Prober planted a latent gene, right? And the idea was that at some point along the line of whatever comes after these Wanderers, this gene will manifest. And when it does, that will give birth to whatever it gives birth to. And so that's the reason why Marvel gives us characters like the Incredible Hulk. And it's why Bruce Banner didn't die of radiation sickness when he was hit with gamma rays, right? This latent gene activated and he became the Incredible Hulk. It allowed him to tap into all that wrath and anger he had from the abusiveness that he suffered at the hands of his father. And then the Incredible Hulk was born. Now, from there, you start going into what's basically hearsay and kind of like maybe it's true, maybe it's not. Not so much in the fan base, but in so much as how the stories are told, right? So you have this guy named Forever Man who simply makes a claim that he was one of the first mutants to ever exist, right? I mean, you don't really know anything about him. All you know is that when he dies, he just reincarnates every single time without fail. Forever Man hasn't been seen for a while, and as far as I'm aware, he doesn't exist in Jonathan Hickman's X-Men run, so there's no real reason to believe that he's a part of anything anymore. And you kind of get that a little bit, right? I mean, now, you do get Shadow King, and Shadow King is one of these more interesting characters because he's a multiversal concept, right? So Shadow King exists in a way to where he's like the Phoenix Force, right? There's one Shadow King that expands throughout the entirety of the multiverse. Now, if you go based on what we had seen like in the old school, well, not really the old school comics, but if you go and you look at what you saw with like X-Men True Friends #2, right? Like you kind of get this explanation, and this was a story, by the way, that came out in 1999, so it's relatively old school. But what you basically get is this explanation from the Shadow King that like he's basically existed since the dawn of man, right? But like if you go and you look at other comics, it's the Shadow King came into existence when the first nightmare was experienced, so the first bad experience, the first terrible scenario, or the first ounce of hatred or something like that. It kind of waxes and wanes. But the idea here is that the Shadow King is really more of an ethereal entity, not really a mutant in the traditional sense, so I don't know why people classify him that way. But then you start to go into Selene. Now, Selene is a character where it seems like Hickman is kind of ignoring her. We're not 100% sure. And the reason why is because in the most recent iterations of House and Powers of X, the most recent issues, we're simply told that like Apocalypse was the first mutant. Now, this storytelling is told from the perspective of Krakoa, who's a living island. But just because he's a living island doesn't mean he knows everything. So it could be that Krakoa doesn't know. It could be that Jonathan Hickman is basically saying that Selene is not actually a mutant. It could be that she doesn't exist at all. According to Jonathan Hickman, she doesn't exist exists and she doesn't count, and he's just kind of wiping her away from the pages of the X-Men. We're not really sure yet, and we may never find out. You know, I'm not really sure what direction he's going to go in there. So you can kind of take it for what you want. But basically, Selene is around 17,000 years old, and she's largely considered to be the first in continuity canon mutant, which is to say the first one that you can consistently point to and say she was the first mutant to be born in the history of humanity. From there, you start kind of fast forwarding a bit. You start going into things like biblical times. We talked about the Neophim and the Chearophim, basically these mutants that looked like angels and demons, and they kind of waged a war against one another. If you get into Uncanny X-Men 422, 429, 433, you basically discover there's like this old school, you know, group of mutants that existed some 15,000 years ago. Again, a lot of that's just kind of hearsay. It's like a thing that appears in one comic and it's never expanded on after that, right? It's just kind of there, and you never really find out what in the world is going on. And so to kind of stick with continuity, we sort of fast forward to about 5,000 years ago, and we get in Subodh Noir. Now, there are a couple characters that we can kind of run over there. I mean, you've got like different individuals who have appeared, but none of them really seem to count, at least as far as I'm aware. So kind of going with Subodh Noir, we've talked about him before. We've got a video on Apocalypse Explained, which you guys are welcome to reference. It'll have a lot more information about his character than what we're going to cover here. But the long and short of it is that Apocalypse was essentially born with the ability to alter his own mass and immortality. But in terms of his abilities, he was pretty baseline. It wasn't until he discovered celestial technology and then was finally able to interact with it that he started modifying his own body, right? So everything that Apocalypse has outside of the ability to alter his body's own structure, right? To basically like grow in size, to shrink in size, things like that, and immortality, all of that is artificial, right? All that is basically external enhancements granted to him that were given to him by some form of technology. From there, that's when you start going into more intriguing characters. One of the more intriguing characters that we actually got out of this early era of man was actually a guy named Decimus Furious. Now, Decimus Furious didn't really appear until Uncanny X-Force issue number 3, so he showed up like really more recently and much later on after the original X-Men. But the idea was that he was basically a guy whose powers manifested in such a way that he appeared to be a minotaur and literally was a gladiator at one point. Eventually, he was discovered by Apocalypse and basically sealed away so that he could become one of his final horsemen. That took place during the Dark Angel saga and even a little bit like during the Final Horseman saga as part of like the Apocalypse twins and those characters and things like that during the Uncanny X-Force storyline. But again, like you kind of get these little bits and pieces, these characters that show up here and there and then just kind of appear for a little while and then for some reason or another basically vanish. Now from there, you go into like Bennett Duperry, basically a guy who became Exodus. He was an individual who had these insanely powerful telepathic powers that were latent and then ultimately tapped into by Apocalypse. And then eventually Exodus became kind of a henchman for Apocalypse until he betrayed him and then was locked away. But Exodus was exceedingly powerful, right? He was one of the most powerful and still is one of the most powerful telepaths and telekinetics across the entirety of the Marvel universe, right? I mean, the guy's power is absolutely insane. But probably one of the more interesting developments in the history of the mutant chronology came in X-Factor Volume 3, issue number 10. And this introduced something called the changelings. Now, up until this point, throughout the entirety of mutant history, the development of mutant powers were either tied directly into an emotional state. So in the case of Apocalypse, basically he was heartbroken, and then the emotional torment basically sent his powers into overdrive and they developed and so on and so forth, or they would just arbitrarily happen. There was no real rhyme or reason to it. What the changelings introduced by way of this comic was the idea that mutant powers started manifesting at puberty. Now the question is, why didn't they manifest at puberty before? We're never really given an answer. We're simply just told they were the ones that really started developing powers through puberty, and then it just kind of went from there, right? Now, even now, it's not an absolute thing, right? Powers don't always manifest through puberty. That was kind of the nature of what it is that Oneg had done when it came to planting this latent gene. It was given a timeline insofar as here's how long it will take before this gene starts to activate in terms of the evolutionary progress of humanity, but there was no real standard on here's when this gene will activate in the lifespan of a single human, right? It's just somewhere along the line, it will just pop up. But following those guys and going more into the pre-1000 year period, so about 1,000 years ago, you started running into Proto Mutants. Now again, one of the things to keep in mind when it comes to this evolutionary history of mutants is that for the most part, you had Apocalypse who first popped up, but he was only the first in one geographical location. There were others popping up around the same time, right? So I mean, within a few years of Apocalypse, there were other mutants popping up, or at least presumably so. And we can kind of make that assumption because of the fact that like there are mutants in like Macedonia and other places around the world that Apocalypse either didn't visit or simply passed through, or never really woke the powers up for anybody who lived there. And so because of that, when it comes to the Proto Mutants, all we know is that around Crimea, around 800, maybe 900 years ago, that some group of humans, basically their powers awoke, and then they essentially became what were Proto Mutants. So that is to say, the predecessor to modern day mutants, right? So if Apocalypse and people like him are the mutant equivalent to the Neanderthal, then the Proto Mutants are kind of like the missing link between what Apocalypse was and what modern day mutants are now. The difference is that Proto Mutants were all exceedingly powerful. The problem is there was no one there to really teach them. They just kind of developed powers, they were there, and that was basically it, and they were not indestructible, right? They could be defeated only because they didn't really have a full harness of what their abilities were. Now, a lot of this comes by way of X-Men Volume 3, issue number 31, and that's simply just with the introduction of like Gabriel Shepherd, different things like that, and all we really have is Gabriel Shepherd's word, right? Like what he told us over the course of those particular stories, or at least that one particular story, and he simply kind of offers himself as the most powerful of all the Proto Mutants, right? So while a lot of them were powerful and they were all powerful in their own right, Gabriel Shepherd was the most powerful of them, right? So just because he could stop time, warp reality, doesn't mean anybody else could. But regardless of the scenario, all of the Proto Mutants except for Gabriel Shepherd were wiped out when they were all blamed for the Black Plague in that region of the world. And so because of that, you kind of just start sort of going forward, and you really jump forward by quite some time, right? You start going into the 15th century, you start going into the 16th century, the 17th, 18th centuries, and you start getting these small areas where like mutants began to pop up again. And again, that's the important thing to bear in mind here, is that really up until you get to about the 19th century, mutants are just sort of sporadically introduced and sporadically talked about in Marvel Comics. They're just kind of there. And there's some things that happen and they're never seen or heard from again. And the stories you get oftentimes aren't really even reliable because the person giving us that story is kind of like, well, maybe it's true, maybe it's not. You know, who really knows? It's just told for the sake of telling a story. But at this point, we jump to around the 15th century, and this is when we start getting more interesting characters, right? So this is when you start getting into the character Gideon. Now, Gideon is really one of the more interesting characters that came from the history of Cable, or at least Cable's introduction into Marvel Comics. Now, but Gideon is an example of what we call an external. You would look at Apocalypse and you would say, okay, Apocalypse is an external insofar that he cannot truly be, can't truly die from any sort of external means. You get into Gideon, and then what you basically learn here is that individuals who are externals don't always have the same power, right? Like the only constant theme among them is immortality, the inability to die from age or disease. But with someone like Gideon, he actually had the power to mimic the powers of others, right? So it was cool insofar as how he worked. The problem is that he was kind of a hallmark of the 1990s, and so you didn't really see a whole lot from him after his head was chopped off by Cable. Marvel tried to bring him back more recently, but as a product of the 90s, he doesn't really fit in today's more modern stories. But for what it's worth, he was certainly one of the more prominent externals back then in terms of his activities, right? So I mean, he was part of Columbus's expedition that came to the United States and so on and so forth. But that's when you start getting into things like Sabretooth. That's when you start getting into things like Wolverine, where the various appearances of mutants just were kind of sporadic insofar as they were just sort of popped up over the years. What this does is bring a much bigger explosion of mutant population across the world, in the sense that mutants just start blowing up at a much faster rate. Now, one of the big questions a lot of people ask is, why now, right? Like, why is it one of these things where mutants started exploding like this over the years? Honestly, I would argue that it's really more due to just global exploration, right? Because there's a reason why, as you look through this, as humanity began to harness technology that would allow them to explore the world in a more direct way, that mutants started to appear more and more, right? So humans started spreading to more of the world, which led to more intermingling of different genomes, which led to more mutants being born. Again, once you start getting into this era, you start getting into like the 1800s, and you start getting into characters like Mr. Sinister. Now, Nathaniel Essex traditionally is not a mutant. What really seems to be happening here with Jonathan Hickman is he seems to be hitting on the idea that he is, right? That Sinister is actually a mutant. And it's kind of interesting because it could go either way. The original stories of the Adventures of Cyclops and Phoenix, Nathaniel Essex had powers bestowed to him by Apocalypse. What Jonathan Hickman could do is easily come along, wipe that away, and say, well, powers were bestowed only insofar as Apocalypse woke up the latent gene of Sinister, and this is the form he took. But then you start getting up to the 1900s when you start getting into Burke, Saul, Absalom, Nicodemus, and Gideon. And again, like Gideon had already come into existence, the other ones basically form the kind of inner circle of the externals, right? Now, this is not really a council that existed so much as like they existed into like a singular sanctuary and they just sort of dictated what they were going to do with the world or anything like that. They weren't like the Illuminati or anything along those lines. These are basically just kind of like a loose circle insofar as they all share a common trait and they're all aware of the other's existence. But then around that time, between 1891 going to about 1900, that's when you basically get into the birth of James Howlett, Wolverine. That's when you get into Silas Burr. That's when you start getting into characters like Ogun. These are really, really interesting concepts. These really cool individuals who develop their powers. But going from the 1900s up into the modern day, that's when you got this massive explosion of the mutant population, right? And that's one of the things people ask. I don't really know what the answer to that question is, but that's when you got this massive explosion of the mutant population insofar as you started getting like all these characters born, right? So like Magneto was born in the 1920s. You basically had Wolfgang Heinrich, who was born in the 1930s. You had like Amal Farouk, who basically started becoming more active in the main Marvel universe at the turn of the century, and then going into the World War I and then during the World War II era, or at least pre-World War II era, all these mutants that were basically exploding in prominence. Now, a lot of these mutants who existed during that time, especially during World War I and World War II, were thought to have been some kind of like strange abnormality. And indeed, they kind of were, insofar as like they were the next step in human evolution. The issue is that at the time, humanity humanity didn't really know what they were. They didn't really know how they functioned or how any of that stuff worked. And so they kind of saw them as more akin to like, not really witches or anything like that, or like warlocks, but just as like unknown quantities. And so what you ended up having around that time during World War I and World War II is those individuals who were in Europe and who were captured by Germans during that time were thrown into concentration camps. But instead of making them into individuals who would work, instead they were handed over to Nathaniel Essex, who at this point was operating under the moniker of Mr. Sinister, and then manipulating their genes, basically like experimenting on them, going all through these like heinous experiments and things like that, but to kind of see how their genes worked and what causes the mutant gene to activate, different things along those lines. So again, you get into some pretty dark times in terms of the mutant population and the mutants' overall history. But again, getting into characters like Christopher Nord, right? Christopher Nord is a character that not a lot of people have talked about, that we haven't really talked about, but basically his code name was Maverick. He was part of the original Team X from the team that Wolverine served on before he was inducted into the Weapon X project. But again, like it's one of these things where different countries were trying to find a way to basically cope with the mutant threat on their own, right? So like the Soviet Union initially was basically euthanizing mutant children. And it was kind of crazy because if you go back and you look at the old stories of Colossus before he was actually brought into the X-Men, or at least not really old stories, they came after his original introduction in Giant Size X-Men #1. But if you go back and you look at his origin stories, one of the things that the Soviet Union was doing is they were euthanizing mutant children because they were afraid that they would rise up against the Soviet Union and overthrow the existing government. It wasn't until later on that they realized they could be used as a means to basically create their own kind of elite fighting force, right? Like superpowered fighting force. Now, a lot of that was in response to like the Avengers of the United States. And so that's why, you know, around the time that Colossus was found in the mid to late 1960s, that what the Soviet Union was doing was it was going around and it was capturing anybody who was a mutant and then forcing them and even brainwashing them to become a servant of the Soviet Union proper. In the United States, you actually had Project Wide Awake, which we've talked about before. But in Canada, you had Department H, and so you basically had Alpha Flight, different things like that. But it was basically this huge expansion where humanity began to look at the mutant population and see them as a potential threat insofar as, okay, these guys could potentially kill us, we have to get rid of them, to looking at them and saying, but wait, we can use them for our own means, and then moving forward accordingly. Going into the mid-1960s, of course, that gets us really closer to the modern day. You have Charles Xavier who comes along, and you basically have all the stories of the X-Men up to that point. Now, for Charles Xavier, this is a pretty significant moment because this was really the first time that a mutant with the ability to rally together a team came into contact with the Shadow King. Up until that point, those individuals who were possessed by the Shadow King were thought to have been possessed by Satan, right? Like possessed by like a demon or something like that. And usually there were attempts to kill them off. Sometimes the Shadow King would wipe out an entire village. You know, sometimes they would successfully manage to kill the host. But regardless of the circumstance, during that time, after Xavier had met Magneto, the two of them parted ways, and then Xavier went on his own. He ended up traveling to Egypt, and he met Amal Farouk, who of course was the host body for the Shadow King. And that was when Xavier realized that there were some mutants out there who couldn't be bargained with. All they wanted to do was basically just inflict as much hatred and pain as they possibly could, and then to basically treat them that way and band a team together that could defeat mutants like that. But then you start going into, again, this sort of expansion. I mean, at this point, it's really more the modern day, the modern era of mutants, getting us up to like the launch of the X-Men. Mutants who were cropping up, mutants who were doing their own thing, mutants who were becoming part of the X-Men team, or else joining Magneto and his Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, possibly even becoming a part of the Hellfire Club. Because around this time, remember, you've got the birth of Emma Frost, you've got the birth of Sebastian Shaw, Donald Blake. You've got a lot of these guys out there who are basically kind of coming out and developing their own history. I mean, from that point, it kind of gets us into the modern day, so we can probably sort of stop here. But in terms of the chronological history, there are some things we left out here and there, but again, a lot of that stuff is just sort of hearsay. It's just sort of like there's a character in a comic book who makes a claim and we don't really know if it's true or not. We just kind of have to sort of go with what seems to be in continuity, right? I mean, characters like Dakin being born in 1946, yes, you know, I mean, you go back and you read something like Wolverine Weapon X Files #1, that confirms it, right? I mean, that confirms when Dakin was born. But again, you know, it's kind of a cool little history there. It's sort of out there. I mean, I really hope that one of the things that Hickman does as part of his X-Men run is create this almost kind of 0-hour crisis in time from DC sort of map where we get this chronological history of the mutant population, something sort of etched in stone. And so instead of having to do like we do here, where we basically go through like 50, 60, even 100 different comic books to basically sort of try to pick out these little bits of history and so on and so forth, then instead we have it like one single cohesive place. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.